Hey guys, it's been a while since we talked about the judging criteria systems, but a couple weeks ago I was talking with a friend of mine, Francesco, and we were trying to come up with some sort of better system or or way of judging, and so we brainstormed a couple of ideas. I wanted to share one of them with you. See what you guys think about this. Um, One of the first things we talked about is that it may be beneficial to have some judges focus on scoring the difficulty of a run, and other judges focus on scoring everything else, basically flow, execution, creativity. We argued a lot about the word for creativity because we thought that creativity doesn't necessarily capture what we're actually looking for when we talk about creativity, because we threw around the word versatility and creativity, and is making use of more of the equipment being more creative, or is making use of one spot in a lot of different ways creative? Is making use of the more of the equipment more versatile? Is using more skills on one area versatile? What does that mean? And so I think one of the important conversations we need to have is what the heck we actually mean by creativity, because as we were talking about it, I realized that we all kind of get what creativity is. Like when you look at it, you can go, oh, that's creative. But in order to judge it effectively, I think we need at least some sort of definition. And that doesn't have to be the same across all competitions. One of the other things we talked about is that I think it doesn't really matter necessarily how you do this, as long as you're very clear to your competitors at the beginning what each thing means. And I think just sitting down with the athletes and saying, this is what we're looking for here. This is what we're looking for here. This is what we're looking for here. And then let them ask questions too, because then you avoid situations where if you are judging skills landed on concrete or less hard than you're judging skills landed on grass, just clarify that. And then it doesn't matter. Who cares if you're doing that? As long as it's clear, then the athletes can go, oh, okay, I was planning on doing super hard skill A to grass and kind of hard skill B to concrete. Maybe I'll just focus on kind of hard skill B to concrete instead, because it's not worth risking, the detriment to my score from landing on grass. As long as you're clear, I think that's fine. And especially when it comes to creativity, explain what the hell you mean by creativity. Just explain it. If you think that using more of the course is better, explain that. If you think that it doesn't matter how much of the course you use, as long as the skills are interesting and unique, if uniqueness is what you're looking for, explain that. But make sure you're clear about that. We settled on basically that our definition of creativity was both how specific your run was to the location. So could your run or skills have been done anywhere, or were they more specific to the location? Because the more specifically you use where you're at, the more you're demonstrating your adaptability. And maybe adaptability is a better word for that. So that combined with the uniqueness of your skills was kind of how we ended up describing creativity. But the other reason for this, and the reason for separating difficulty and everything else, is because I talked about how I don't think you can separate all of the, facets of it. You kind of have to take in the run as a whole. But as I was thinking about it, I was thinking that the only thing you can separate is difficulty from everything else. If you have one person watching difficulty, they don't have to worry about how the skill is done. All they have to do is look at the skills and decide how difficult they are, which is a lot easier than trying to decide how difficult they are based on how well somebody lands them. Because it's easy to say that something is harder if someone lands it poorly because it looks more challenging. Or some people may look at someone land something poorly and say, I don't think that was as difficult because it didn't look as good. So if you can just focus on the skill itself and how hard that is, that gives you a better opportunity to give a more fair score for that. And then everyone else who's judging flow, execution, creativity, versatility, whatever the heck you want to use the words are, they don't have to worry about how hard the moves are. They can just look at the line and go, this looked good. It had these facets. It looked good in these areas. The flow was lacking. The execution was good, but the flow was lacking. The creativity was high. The execution was not so good. Like, they can look at those things, because I do think those things all play together. If you're looking at a run, you're not just looking at the flow. You're looking at the flow, because execution affects flow. If the execution is terrible, flow's probably not good. Sometimes it might be, but probably not. If the creativity is very high, the flow may be lower because it's more difficult to connect these things. So we found that was a system that we felt like gave a more accurate picture. So if you have 4 judges, you could have 2 of them looking at difficulty so that those 2 can then debate whether or not they agree with the difficulty scores of the other person. And then 2 people scoring everything else, and they can debate over whether or not they got the same score. And then what we ended up deciding is that difficulty, and you'll see here, difficulty would end up being a number between 0 and 1. It would be a decimal. Everything else is scored out of 4. And what you would do is after the 2 judges have each agreed, you would multiply your flow, execution, creativity score by your difficulty. And what we found is that this ends up creating what we felt was more accurate scores. We tried it by testing out scoring a bunch of runs from Art of Motion submissions. We just would watch them. I would score the difficulty, he would score the other thing. We'd debate, put them together, and we'd end up with scores. And we felt that they more accurately reflected how good the runs were. But also, they ended up being pretty similar to the actual results of the Art of Motion, at least in terms of who got in versus who didn't. But it at least gave clarity to why those people got in. And so this is why I think just having this available and talking about it more makes it easier. Because then if an athlete knows, this is why I lost, they go, all right, that's why I lost. Or if for some reason they disagree, they can go up to the judges. This is another thing we talked about. You should be able to put in an appeal. And this is something that you can do in gymnastics. If you really think that something's wrong, you can put in an appeal. But having to go up to the judges and say, I disagree and here's why, people are not likely to do that if they don't really think something's wrong. You don't want to embarrass yourself by going up and being like, I didn't win. I should have won because I did this. You're not going to do that. But if you genuinely are confused and you're like, this doesn't seem to make sense with what this other person got, vice versa, then you can go up to the judges and say, hey, we disagree with this. You and your coach can go up and say, we disagree. And they can look into it and then either decide, hey, you know what? We actually agree with you. We're going to change it. Or, hey, you know what? We stand by our decision. And I think that appeals system would help a lot. And I'm going to get to there's going to be a lot of random stuff in here because this is not very structured, but I'm going to touch on a lot of things that we talked about in terms of appeal system and stuff like that. But so the way the difficulty is scored, if we look at this, is we tried it a bunch of different ways, but what we ended up thinking that the most accurate depiction of difficulty was by averaging the difficulty of each of the skills in the run. So if you did one hard skill and a bunch of easy skills, you end up with a much lower average difficulty than if you do a lot of medium hard skills together. It ends up giving a better picture of the whole run. Because if you do one hard thing and then a bunch of nonsense, it's not that hard of a run. You did one hard thing, that's dope. If you do a bunch of nonsense, you get an extremely low difficulty score. And so even if you do everything perfectly, if you do a bunch of non-moves or a bunch of very easy moves, you're not going to score very highly. You can do everything perfect. You can get 12, and if your difficulty is 0.1, you're not going to do well. It's just not going to work like that. Whereas if you do one hard thing, doing one hard thing should not make you win out against somebody who did everything perfectly. If you do one hard thing and you do it off terribly, but it's super hard, it shouldn't make you win. And that works in this because your average will still be lower if you only do one hard thing. But if you do a bunch of consistently difficult skills, your average difficulty is going to be significantly higher, which means your total score is going to be higher because you are going to get a higher multiplier. So the highest score you could possibly get in this system would be 12. As we were ranking the difficulties of individual skills, because the way we did it is that each skill that wasn't just a parkour movement, so each skill that wasn't a lazy vault, because I feel like skills like that play into the flow, but not the difficulty. Doing a lazy vault is doing a lazy vault. Doing a palm spin is doing a palm spin. Everything that is a flip or an acrobatic skill gets scored on its difficulty, and that's this is where we got into another thing where you need to be able to have a replay of the run, because scoring individual skills very quickly is challenging. But also, we noticed watching lines one time through, it's so easy to miss so much. If judges don't have the ability to look back on a run, they're only able to really guess. Like if they missed something, they just have to go, I guess it was this. It looked kind of good. You should be able to look back on it as a judge. You should be able to go, oh, wait, I missed that one thing. Was this or was this something else? Oh, that changes the score completely. That's a 0.3 difficulty instead of a 0.1. right? And so that's what we ended up deciding made a lot more sense, is having instant replays. You need to be able to have instant replays for judges. But you score individual skills on their difficulty somewhere between 0 and 1. So a 0.5 would be a medium hard skill. A 0.9 would be the hardest skill ever, or like a 0.95 or something like that. Like if you do pop, cast, gainer, pre to one leg, that's probably really high difficulty. Whereas something like a Webster is probably more like a 0.1 or a 0.2. And this is why having 2 judges is helpful, because then if they disagree on the difficulty of individual skills, they can average them out, and you end up with an equal thing. It also showed us that we kind of need to start having a way of measuring difficulty. This is where we get into stuff like a code of points, which I don't necessarily want us to have, as long as we can all agree that 2 qualified judges debating over the difficulty of the skill will end up with a good quality number. That's what we have to do. We have to basically know that we can trust our judges who are debating amongst each other to come up with what we feel is an accurate representation of the difficulty of a skill. Or we have to come up with a standardized list of difficulties of skills. And that's up for debate. I would be really interested to hear which one you guys think is better. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. I personally would prefer that we just trust our judges, but that requires a lot more transparency from the judging system, which again is something I'm for. But that's basically how you score difficulty, and then you average out all the moves. So doing less skills and more skills in a line also adjusts things, and that's kind of important, because doing a whole bunch of stuff, if it's all hard, is really impressive, whereas doing a couple things, even if they're hard, is not as impressive, but maybe more. Because if you do a bunch of stuff and it's all you're basically, the more skills you do, the more you're diluting the difficulty of your score. And so it's better to have, because I think a lot of us would agree that a longer run isn't necessarily better if it's like by the time you're done watching it, you're like, okay, get on with it. But a 3-move line that's just banger connected to banger is like mind-blowing to watch. You're like, holy crap, even if it's not long. We can still all agree, I think, that it's impressive. The other thing we noticed as we were talking about all this is so not an exact science, and this is very, very much in the early stages. And so I want everyone to remember, as we're discussing this, that we're at the very early stages of this. Don't expect it to be perfect from anybody. Like, we can all agree that maybe Art of Motion doesn't have the best judging system, or maybe NAPC doesn't have the best judging, but give them a little bit of slack, okay? Understand that these people are probably trying. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they're trying to do their best. We got to recognize that and go, thank you. We appreciate what you're doing for the sport, okay? Don't trash talk anybody. It doesn't help us. We can suggest improvements, but nobody's going to listen to your suggestions if you just go, you suck, you're a terrible judge, you have a horrible system, we need to fix it. Nobody's going to listen to you. They're going to be like, excuse me, what are you doing for this community? So just respect that as we're having this conversation. Try to understand that everybody's trying. We're all trying our best. That being said, we still have to accept the fact that what we're doing right now isn't perfect, and we need to improve it. But so what we ended up noticing as we did all this, and you guys can tell me what you think about this, but we ended up with scores usually being somewhere in the 3 to 6 area. We ended up with some lower ones and some higher ones, but somewhere between 3 and 6 was where the average score came out, because most people do not have lines that have a 9 difficulty at the end average. They ended up with an average somewhere between 0.2, 0.6, something like that. I think the highest one we scored of the Art of Motion ones we looked at was Jared Ludy, one of Jared Ludy's lines. I think it was the one where he went backflip, catch, immediate low cat side, and then immediate cast gainer. That was the highest one we scored, which we felt reflected the quality of it, because even though it was short, everything was connected, and that upped the difficulty, and each of the skills done was hard. Cat side on its own may not necessarily be hard, but on as low of a thing as he did it on, it makes it a lot more challenging. The backflip catch on its own wasn't particularly hard, but the catch made it slightly more challenging. And then it was all connected very quickly, and so everything else was scored relatively high. So we felt that what we ended up with is that one was the highest one we scored. That was like a 5 point something, I think. Don't quote me on that. But, one of the lower ones we scored was a series of basically simple parkour movements and basic flips. And so not a bad line, but a good line and a good competition line are two very different things. And this is another thing that we came upon is like competition lines are very different from regular training lines. You can't just do a regular training line in competition. It has to be more challenging. It has to be interesting to watch. It has to be difficult. And so that's what we ended up seeing. Now, a couple issues that popped up, because I want to address these immediately, because I'm not saying that this is the best system at all. This is one that we settled on that we thought was pretty good, or at least better than what we had now. So scoring the difficulty of parkour movements. This is where it's difficult, because I know I said that basic parkour skills like lazy vault, stuff like that, didn't get a difficulty score. Giant precisions should probably get a difficulty score. Really difficult, like catbacks, should probably get a difficulty score. And so there needs to be more conversation about that and how does that stack up? Because I think that a giant precision can easily be a lot more difficult than a flip, depending on the flip and depending on the precision. So we'd have to have a conversation about how difficult those are. And I think it may be as simple as anything above a basic parkour skill like a vault or something like that should probably get a difficulty score. So any of the big things in a line. So a giant rail pre should get a difficulty score, and it should be, based on the surface, the distance, how well it's done, the confounding factors, things that make the skill on its own harder to do in this particular situation. So like if you have to direction change, things like that. That was one issue we came upon. The second issue we already talked about, which was having a standardized difficulty number or trusting our judges. And then the third one was the system of appeals, because, the third one was not the system of appeals. The third one was how to make it so that the first people who go, so in a normal competition, the first people who go are going to get scored lower. You can't start giving 10s, like perfect 10s out the gate, because then you have nowhere to go if people are going to do harder things. And this is a challenging thing to get over in a competition. One thing I heard somewhere, and I forget who said this, was that in like martial arts competitions, the first 3 people go, they don't get a score right away. The judges deliberate, then they release the scores of the first 3 people, and then everyone else goes one at a time after that, so that they have the first 3 people to sort of set a scale of things. I think that is really smart. You could take that a step further even and have everybody go and then release the scores. I know everyone would hate to see that because it's not, and maybe that's not as exciting to watch, and so maybe that won't end up being something that we do. But I do like the idea of the first couple people going to create a good scale for the judges, and then they release those scores. We also talked about the difference between a big trick competition and a normal style competition. We talked about, especially in a big trick competition, maybe not showing scores until the end, because sometimes if the person before you goes and they get a certain score and you had something planned, you might change what you're going to do because you're like, I got to go harder to beat that person. And we also talked about in a big trick competition, submitting to the judges what you're going to do beforehand so that they can already have the difficulty scored and they can only watch for the execution. This also solves the problem that we talked about of having, a warm-up area and judges seeing what you're going to do before you do it. If you submit to the judge what you're going to do beforehand, 1, it prevents you from changing it if somebody before you gets a higher score. And 2, it means that the judges aren't surprised. They can watch specifically for execution, which is easier because if you're watching for difficulty and execution at the same time, the execution may sway your difficulty score when it shouldn't. A move is difficult on its own. It is also executed in whatever way it's executed. The execution does not change the difficulty, or it shouldn't, in my opinion. The execution should lower the overall score for sure. If the difficulty is high, but the execution is terrible, you shouldn't score as high as the difficulty was. But if the execution is low, it shouldn't also lower the difficulty. That doesn't really work. The other thing we talked about was, in terms of warm-up areas, was that I think it is very important for there to be a separate warm-up area, or for the judges to not come in until everybody is warmed up. Because it's harder to have a separate warm-up area for athletes. It's a lot easier to just put the judges in a room and close them in, and then they come out right before like the competition starts. That makes a lot more sense, and then you prevent the problem of losing the wow factor. But so tell me what you guys think about this. I'd love to hear your ideas. This is, like I said, this is absolutely not the best method. This is just a method that my friend and I settled on that we think makes a lot of sense in terms of balancing difficulty and everything else, and creating a system that rewards what I think the parkour community as a whole wants to reward in movement, because we have the problem of you don't want to just reward difficulty, but you also don't want to make it so that there's no point in doing hard skills. But yeah, that's the idea. Let's hear your thoughts. I want to keep this conversation going. It took off and started talking, and then people stopped talking about it a little bit. So let's keep talking about it. Okay, but be respectful as you talk about it. Remember that people are trying their best, and don't trash talk anybody. All right. See you guys later.